Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University. In this video, let's take a look at how to generate and work with variables, how to generate and work with random numbers in VBA, and third, let's take a look at how to prompt a student for some input while an application is running, and we'll store that in a variable and output it in a text box. To begin, let's look at working with variables in VBA. What is a variable? If you've done any coding in Scratch, you'll already know what a variable is. It's a named location in program code for storing data. In other words, if you were working with a calculator, it would be like the memory function, where you could say, plug this particular value into and store it in a memory. So a variable in VBA is like saying in algebra, let x equal 5, which would be an integer, a whole number, or let x equal Dr. Steve, in quotes, because that would be a string, in other words, text. When you're coding in VBA, to use a variable, you have to start by declaring it with a dim statement. So DIM actually refers to dimension. So it's a memory term within the computer. So we'll start by saying dim space and put the name of the variable. Now you get to make up this name. The only thing is that you need to not have any spaces. It has to be one solid word. So if you're going to create some compound names, then either two main conventions are if you move into the second word, just capitalize the second word, or you can use an underscore character. After you create the name, we're going to say as, and then we're going to put the type of data that it's going to hold. So will it be text, will it be some form of number, or will it be something else? So dim, the name of the variable, and you make that up, as, and then we put the data type. There are three main variable types in VBA. A number is normally an integer. So when we say an integer, notice the range of numbers. We're talking about minus 32,768 up to 32,767. Again, for teachers, mostly for whole numbers, we're going to be in that range. So for the most part, if you're going to declare a variable to be a whole number, we'll call it an integer. Notice there are also other number types, long, single, and double. So again, for math folks, maybe that's something that you'll need to tap into. We also have another main type, which is string, and this simply means text. Another popularly used variable type is Boolean, and Boolean refers to a value that's either going to be true or false. So in coding, we can set some variable, like some monitor of some activity or some parameter, to be true, and then we can look later to see if something turned it to be false. That's how that's used. So integers, strings, and Boolean are three of the major data types that most people will use. When you're coding in VBA, here are some examples of how you can declare variables. And notice I'm using those three most commonly used types of variables. So first I declare it, dim n, so n will be the name of the variable, as integer. So you know that that's going to hold some value that's a whole number. N equals 15. This is how I can assign that value. If I say n equals 15, now it's like a memory that's holding that value of 15. Now another type that you might use is single. So if we say dim n as single, now n can hold a number such as this with some decimals. If I want to create a string, that means it's going to hold text. I could create a name such as dim my name, and notice I use the convention of when I start the second word, I capitalize that second word. I could also put an underscore, a little underline character after the word my, because you cannot have any spaces in between the name of your variable. So if I say my name as string, then when I assign a value to it later in coding, I can say my name equals, and then I could put something in quotes, whether it's a sentence or a single word or even a paragraph, and that will be stored. And finally, if I say dim and I make up the word flag as Boolean, it means it's going to either be true or false. So when I'm doing my coding, I could say let the flag equal true at this point, or let the flag equal false. And then as part of my coding, I can always go in and say, is the flag true or is it false? For example, if we are coding a game, and if the person wins a hand, let's say, we could state, let the flag now equal true, that the person is going to be a winner. Here's a little hint to create more efficiency when you're declaring variables. Now you could declare variables all on separate lines as I have listed here, but you could also do this. The contents of the left screen are the same as on the right screen. Notice I took dim n as integer, and I took my name as string, and I simply put a comma in between them, still using the dim statement. And then notice that I have all of these statements, instead of saying dim a, b, c, and x, here I did the same thing. One dim statement, a comma, b comma, and so on, as integer. And then, to include this word total as string, I simply put a comma, and the dim statement still refers to that. Dim total as string. So you could type all of this separately, or you could shrink it down by doing this if you choose. For our first coding challenge, let's work with a variable. Let's declare and assign a variable as described on a button. And then let's output the answer to a message box. Or, optionally, you could output the answer to a text box. So what would the coding look like? Well, this button described that we would present a whole number. We would generate it and present it. So I created a subroutine and I called it whole number. And I created, so I said the dimension, the dim statement, I called the variable whole num. I said a whole number is going to be an integer, so whole number, I declared it as integer. Then I said let whole num equal, and I just came up with the number 5. And then I want to output it somewhere. So in this case I said a message box, show me whole num. I also could have taken the coding statement from the coding cheat sheet and said let's place this variable contents of whole num, which would in this case be a number 5, and let's output that to a text box on the screen. Now if I wanted to change this and say let's do a decimal number or something else, then I would simply change the type of variable that I'm using. If I wanted to have some text here, then I could have written on the button display some text, and then I would simply say dim whatever variable name as string, and then here I would say whatever the variable name is equals, and then for text I'd have to put it in quotation marks. Now let's take a look at how to create random numbers in VBA. As we saw in Scratch, you can have the computer system generate a random number. So let's try that. First of all, the thing that's going to create the random number is this command rnd. So when we in VBA invoke the rnd random command, it's going to produce a random string. It's actually many more decimals than this. I'm just truncating it off here for the sake of placing it on the screen. So this is certainly a very random looking number. Now, the other thing we want to do is we want to multiply it by something in order to make a whole number out of it. So all random numbers are going to be like this, 0 point something. So if I multiply it by 10, this is going to happen. I've got, instead of 0.9, I have 9 point something. Now if I say times 10, of course it moves to decimal place. If I say plus 1, it means that we're not going to get a 0 as one of the options. Now if I leave off plus 1 and say random times 10, one of the numbers can indeed be a 0. So here we've got a random number between 1 and 10, and then we're going to, in front of that, we're going to put parentheses around all of these commands and say int, which means the integer portion. In other words, the whole number portion. So now I'm holding a random number. I've multiplied it by 10 to move the decimal place, added 1 so that there's no 0 as a possible result here. In parentheses, we're saying do all of this and just pull the integer, the whole number portion out, and here's our 9. And then my final step is I'm going to say let some variable, in this case I just chose x, so I would dim x as an integer, meaning a whole number, let x equal this, and here I've got a random number between 1 and 10. I can go further, and I can say, how about a random number between 1 and 100? So the plus 1 eliminates the 0, so there's 1, and times 100 moves the decimal place 2 times. This is the command to generate random numbers between 1 and 100. And finally, if I wanted to do, let's say, dice rolls for typical gaming, I would just say between 1 and 6 and pull out that integer portion, and now this will always generate a random number between 1 and 6, or a dice roll. Now let's try a coding challenge. Let's create a math flashcard. So the challenge will be, let's generate 2 integers between 1 and 100, and then let's add them together, and we'll show the result. Let's take a look at how we're going to do it. First of all, let's take a look at what we're going to work with. I'm going to create a button for a new problem, and that way I can put the coding, the VBA coding, and associate it with this. And then I'm going to create a, and here I just have this as a placeholder right now, a text box that's going to hold a variable, and I'm going to call my variable num1. And the same thing here, a second variable, num2. So both of these are going to be integers, whole numbers. I'll draw a line on the PowerPoint slide, and then I'm going to create one more text box, and this text box will hold the answer, and in this case I'm going to call the variable that's going to hold the answer sum. So let's take a look at how we might code that. So now in the VBA coding screen, I'm going to create a name for my subroutine. So I'm calling it display nums. And again, you could make up any name that you'll recognize. And this is what we'll look for when we're going to associate this subroutine with a button on the slide. So here I've created that, and of course we put the parentheses here for parameters, which we aren't going to have any. And then we're going to dim, or in other words, create 3 different variables. I'm going to create dim num1 as integer, num2 as integer, and sum as integer. And we already saw I could have said, to consolidate this, dim num1, comma, num2, comma, sum as integer. Put them all on one line if I chose. Now I'm going to say let num1 hold an integer between 1 and 100. And I'll do the same thing with num2. And then finally, since each of these variables now, num1 and num2, are holding a whole number, I'm going to add them and put them into a third variable called sum. Now I just also could have easily said dim x, y, and z. And then I would have said let z equal x plus y. So again, the variables are whatever you want to call them, whatever is going to be easiest for you to work with. Continuing in this subroutine, now that we have all the math completed, now we simply have to display all of this information for the user to see. And again, from the cheat sheet, the coding cheat sheet that I've created, you can draw this information. Active presentation, dot slides, and then in here you'll put the number of the slide. Dot shapes. Remember, the shape you want to give that text box that you create some name, and a standard is to say txt and something. So in this case, I'm going to call that text box and rename it text num1. And that way, when I show the num1 variable, I'll keep them straight. Then dot text frame, which means the text box, dot text range. I realize this is breaking here just for the sake of this screen. It's one word, dot text. So what's the text that's going to go into that text box? Equals num1. So num1 will now be showing. The same thing will happen here in the second text box, and I'll display the second number. Then finally, the sum of those two numbers, which is stored in a variable called sum, will appear in the text, and I've called it txt answer. Again, it doesn't matter what you call your text boxes, it doesn't matter what you call your variables, as long as you keep them straight. That's what counts. So when we put all of this coding in and we associate it with a button, every time we press the button, lo and behold, we'll see two numbers appear and the answer. Let's do a slight variation on this and take the coding we already created and just modify it slightly. What we're going to do in this case is we're going to say, once again, we can press a button, but we've got two buttons now, one of which will add the numbers, and the second of which will still generate two numbers between 1 and 100, but this time it will subtract them. Let's take a look at what the coding would look like for this challenge. Here I've modified my names of the variables slightly, because many times people will use algebraic terms like x, y, and z, or ABC. So here I'm just doing the same thing we did before. This time in one statement I'm saying dim x, y, and z as an integer. X and y will both hold the integer portion, the whole number portion of a random number between 1 and 100. Same thing we did. And here I'm saying let z equal x plus y. So this is going to be the add numbers one. And then I'll do the same thing we did before. This time I'm going to put an x and y in the two text boxes. The z will be the answer. If I want to change this to subtract numbers, all I have to do is now copy all of this code, and then I'm going to create a new subroutine, subtract nums. I'll keep all of this the same. The only thing I have to change is one thing. Z equals x minus y. Everything else stays the same. Slight variation, but we get to reuse the coding we already did and yet get more flexibility. This way the student can press the plus button or the minus button and get two different types of problems. One last quick thing. Let's take a look in this video how to gather user input. You can gather user input, which is a really great thing to be able to do, to be interactive with the student live while the presentation runs. And what we'll do is we'll use an element called an input box. So we've used message box before. Now we'll use input box. This element will display a special message box that is designed to ask the user a question. And then it's going to, ideally we want to store this response, this answer, in some variable. Let's take a look at how it's coded. From our coding cheat sheet, you can copy this coding. We're going to come up with some variable name. For example, if we're going to ask the user for his or her name, we can call it username. So I'd have to say dim username as string. So username, let that equal, and now we're going to use the input box command. So we say input box, again, that's a specified item. The system will now open up a text box, or it'll open up a message box, and it's going to say, please enter your name. Well, whatever it's going to say, in parentheses, we have to say prompt colon equals, and then in parentheses, we put the string. So I said, please enter your name with a colon after. And then I put a comma after this. So a second parameter you can add is the title. Now, if you say title, again, notice there's a colon and an equals. Now, you know that when there's, and I'm going to say enter name, when Windows will, or in Mac, when a window opens, in any platform, when a window opens, there's normally a title in the box to reinforce what that box is doing. So that's what title means. And the prompt will be the question, or the prompt that is shown to the user. And the word input box we have to use because that's what's going to generate that whole thing to happen. And finally, while you can generate that, where's it going to go? We have to let some variable set to be equal to whatever the user enters in. So let's try coding this. The coding challenge will be to use the input box to prompt the student to enter his or her name. Then we're going to place their name in a variable. And finally, we're going to use it somewhere. We're going to output it into a text box. So let's see how that's going to look in terms of coding. But first of all, here we'll press the button. The student will press the button. The input box will appear, and then it's going to say, please enter your name, and then the student name will appear here, and this will be a text box. Let's take a look at the coding. The coding is actually going to be very short, considering all that is going to happen in this subroutine. So I'm creating a name for my subroutine. In this case, I'm going to call it ask student name. I'm going to create a variable, so dim, and I created this, I'm going to call it the username. And I'm going to have to say it's string as string, because of course string means it's going to be text. And then my next step is I'm going to say, go ahead and create that input box, ask the student, please enter your name, and I'll put a title on that little box that appears. And then I'm going to say username, let that username equal whatever they have typed. And then finally, I'm going to use my text box outputting coding to say, let the text of that, and I'm going to call my text box txt student name, just to keep it straight when I'm creating it. Because to me that makes a lot of sense. It's going to be the text box that holds the student's name. So I'm going to refer to that here and say put username, which is this variable up here holding whatever they typed in the input box. And in other words, they'll type their name and it will now appear in a text box. If you can do that, you can ask students for all kinds of information. Like if we go back to the flashcards for a moment, you could say, let's generate a flashcard that will be between 1 and some number. Give me that higher maximum number. And you could do that. You could ask them, do you want it to be addition or subtraction or multiplication? You could ask them different things and then use their input live when this coding functions. That's pretty exciting. Just a quick reminder, remember that once you have added the VBA coding to PowerPoint, you have to save the PowerPoint as one that will respect and contain macros. So remember to select the following save type. Save it as a macro-enabled presentation. So it'll save as something.pptm. So after you save it initially, then you're just going to hit the save button after, and it'll keep saving it as a PPTM. But don't forget to save it in that proper way. If you fail to do that, the system will prompt you. It'll say, well, you have macros out there. Are you sure you want to just let them go away and not save them? And if you see that error message, then you know File, Save As, and then save it as this type of presentation. To put these coding elements into practice, let's try two different coding activities. For our first coding activity, let's create some advanced math flashcards. We'll make a screen that looks similar to this, where a student can select add, subtract, also multiply and divide, and notice I've now added another element here. If they say add, I'm putting a plus sign, so I'll need another text box right here in order to make that happen. In this application, of course, the user will press one of four buttons. When a button is pressed, two random numbers between 1 and 50 will be displayed in two text boxes, and then, according to whether they selected addition or multiplication, whatever it might be, that we'll have another text box, and we'll place that operator in that text box. And then, as we did before, do the math and display the answer in a third text box. And finally this week, our second coding activity will be advanced student input. We're going to ask the student for their name and ask for the name of a pet, and then underneath we'll create two text boxes, one for the student name and a second text box for the name of their pet. In this application, the user will press two different buttons in any order because they're both standalone. Each button will prompt the user to enter information like their name or the name of a pet. And then that same subroutine will, after they type it in, will display the user's input in one of the two text boxes on the screen. I hope you enjoyed this week's coding activities. Next week, let's look at creating embedded formative assessment as we work with variables and also conditional statements in VBA. Have a good week.